Hey guys, welcome to the final lecture of the course. Uh, so I do want to go over a little bit what we'll be doing tomorrow, which is this workshop. And I've unlocked it so you guys can go in and do the pre-readings and even start it if you want to on your own. I believe all the instructions are here. Um, I'll open up the Zoom room tomorrow if you guys want any like one-on-one help and guidance. It's definitely tricky to get it all working together. There's some setup involved with creating. I'm not sure if this makes you do it on your with your own files, um, but if if you just use a code pen or something, then it shouldn't be as much setup. But if you're trying to use your own files, there's a little bit of setup involved that I can help out with. If you want to just do it on some environment like CodePen, which I've been showing you guys before, that's perfectly fine too. You'll just be able to just start writing HTML, CSS for these classes to style the classes, and then JavaScript to grab the elements and make changes to them. So I'll be available for helping you guys out. But you guys are free to take a look and get a jump start on everything as well. So the last lecture will be about functions, and I apologize, I kind of went over things already in the first JavaScript lecture. I feel like in hindsight I should have gone a lot slower in that lecture because I was jumping right into functions and objects. But hopefully, if you guys were lost, you can review it again now, and then it's okay to be lost initially. I get lost all the time still at work, and it's just something I have to just get used to anyways. But hopefully after seeing this again, we'll get this syntax and also the higher level concepts reinforced so that we'll be really proficient in the JavaScript portion of this of all of the CSS of web development. And essentially, by no means, you guys will come to realize that CSS is definitely challenging in its own right, but HTML, after you gain a lot of exposure to it, it's just very static. It's just a bunch of declarations that you make, and so after a while it becomes like second nature and you don't really think about it too much. It's just like your building blocks, but you're declaring them, and there's no logic here. There's no branches, or there's no functions, there's no abstractions. It's literally like what you see is what you get in HTML, versus like actual JavaScript where you might be calling a function that calls a different function, and you have to like follow it down this path. You have to think in abstractions. People, package things away into functions, and we don't know exactly what's happening under the hood. Whereas HTML, it's just declarative. You're just declaring elements. And so initially, I was, when I started out learning, I was like, oh, I really have to get HTML and CSS and JavaScript. But in reality, like JavaScript is where you'll spend a majority of your time, and what has a really high impact on code bases is mostly the JavaScript portion. Now CSS, I'm by no means an expert in CSS, and CSS I feel like you can get really advanced and proficient in terms of like how you're even architecting and designing your CSS files and how they all play together. CSS is also declarative. There's no abstractions or conditional logic based principles here, but it can definitely stay challenging for a long time unless you want to really become an expert in it. But yeah, I would just say JavaScript is where a majority of your time will be spent in learning and in getting and improving as a developer. Um, and if you someday want to, work in not only in the web but you know natively on your desktop, like creating desktop apps or setting up backends for front end developers, or coding in any environment, phones, Internet of Things, like any type of environment, like coding principles will take you. It's a lot more applicable than just pure HTML and CSS, which is only really for the browser. I'm not trying to say that they're not important by any means, but if you guys want to, if you guys have extra time, I would definitely spend it more heavily in JavaScript initially, and the HTML thing will just kind of come as second nature. And yeah, CSS, there's thankfully a lot of developers nowadays can get away with not really doing too much of their own CSS, just because there's a lot of libraries out there that you can just import into your JavaScript code. You import components, which are basically bundles of HTML that are wrapped up in like JavaScript functions, right? So when you call the function, it basically renders the HTML on the page, which is like really nice. So a lot of times you don't even have to deal with like custom CSS. You literally just, what I mean by that is if you guys ever go to like what is it, semantic UI, right? If you go to semantic UI, you can see let's see, so yeah, I mean, let's go to semantic UI React actually. So if you guys it's weird, yeah, so if you guys see here, it's kind of small, but a lot of times nowadays to develop components and such, this is JavaScript, and so you kind of just import a button from a library, and that button is like represents like the HTML with CSS already, but you just kind of call it directly in the JavaScript, and you don't have to write the CSS, you don't have to write the HTML, the raw HTML. You're literally just taking a bundle from someone else's code, and then you're just using that bundle directly in your JavaScript file, and then that is essentially interchangeable with HTML and CSS, and so you don't have to have all these like messy CSS files. Everything is a lot cleaner, and it's just kind of all handled for you in JavaScript. So yeah, I would just try and focus more on the JavaScript initially to start, because if you don't know much CSS and HTML, just knowing JavaScript will take you a lot further than if you just focus on CSS and HTML. Because essentially with JavaScript, you can like stand on the shoulders of giants and use code that other people have written and have created really good reusable libraries, and you can just reuse that. You don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. Versus like HTML and CSS, you can't really, no one really bundled those up into reusable components because they're not reusable by their very nature of like the fact that it's not a programming language, it's just declarative, you're just declaring things. You can't really bundle those up and reuse them and give them to other people. With JavaScript, you can. So by their very nature, like JavaScript is a lot more shareable with other people once you've already written out code that represents, a button or a table, for example. A table. Like you just, all of this, it looks like HTML, but it's actually a JavaScript file, and you can actually, return. This is a function that like returns this is JSX, but it's basically JavaScript, but it kind of is shaped like HTML, but you're just running these all on JavaScript files, and these are all just elements that you're importing from a different library. But I don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole. I think I've been belaboring this point. So functions, they are the core of everything we do. And even here, as you can see here, table example pagination, this is a function. This is like shorthand, like they're doing this because they don't want to write it out. But it's the same thing as doing this. Function, squiggly bracket, return, and then here, return, and then ending the squiggly bracket here. It's the same thing. They just did a shortcut, but essentially they're declaring a function that returns a bunch of HTML elements. We could just think of them as HTML elements. They're not exactly HTML elements in this case. They're JSX that becomes HTML. But it's a function that when you call it, it will be essentially a bag of HTML that you're wrapping up, and you're calling it a table. The benefit of this is like, if you want to, that's how you can like move entire in a website. Let's do like, that's how, you know, when I click, I mean, these could, I'm just making an assumption here. If this was a single page application, meaning that like when I click this, it doesn't talk to the server at all. It just runs JavaScript code that's already here on this page. When you click schedule, like so many elements are changing, right? Like entire large blocks of elements are like disappearing from our view, and then we're adding like a bunch of new elements into our view, and it would be really, really tedious to like move everything one small piece at a time. But when you bundle it up into a function, you can quickly like render new elements by rendering a function called like, let's say we had a function called like header, for example, and that returns this entire header. Then we can just call that function versus having to deal with individual HTML elements. And so functions, they just wrap a bunch of code, and then next time you want to use it, you can just call it, and then you don't have to write all these lines all over again, or handle a bunch of different steps like one by one. You know, you can just wrap it all up into one thing and then reuse it. So if you wanted to bake cookies, every time you wanted to bake cookies, you don't want to like declare the flavor and then declare the batter and then call preheat the oven and then add cookies. Like this all should be just mechanical boilerplate that you just don't even want to think about. And so you wrap it up, you bundle it up into this function called bake cookies, and next time when you call it, all of this stuff happens, but you don't have to, you know, write a bunch of extra code or repeat your logic multiple times. You just kind of wrap it into a function and then you call it. So if you guys notice here, these are inputs that your function gets, and this is how you allow your function to be dynamic. Like, you know, if you want to be able to bake more than just chocolate chip cookies, but you also want to be able to bake cinnamon or snickerdoodle cookies, or you know, white chocolate chip macadamias or oatmeal raisin, you allow that by giving that function input parameters and let the user use it however they want. It's like a tool. And essentially you can, well, tools are like, it's not the greatest example because a hammer is just a hammer. You can't really give it any inputs, but it's more like, you know, those like drills that you can change the, you know, the thickness of the drill bits, and like those interchangeable fancy drills and power tools that you can like exchange the drill bits and such. So it's kind of like that when you decide to make a function that can take in parameters. Is like you choose however you see fit based on your mood or what you need to get done at that point, and it could take inputs, and then that'll change how the internal implementation works. So this is an example of a function. It just it takes in a lot of inputs, and then it adds them all up, and then it returns. So I'm just gonna review returns again, because it's a point of confusion for a lot of people initially, is this return and why is it different from a console log. So if I have a function called get sum, get sum, and then a and b, and then it just return, I just console log a plus b, right? And I call it. So it looks like it's doing its job, and it is doing its job. It's adding a plus b, but we're not saving that value into any variable. So essentially that value is lost. Like, we can't use this value anymore, because I can't, in order for me to get something out of calling a function, I need to return it. If I say sum equals get sum of 1, 2, this sum right here will be undefined. The actual sum is undefined, so I can't use this. I can't really use this function. I can't really use the value of when that function is invoked, because I don't return from it. Now that's completely fine at certain times when all you want your function to do is like produce side effects. Like, you want your function to call different other functions and like set aside and initiate this chain reaction of events that you don't really need a return value from. Then that's fine. You don't ever need a returning from a function is not required. But if you want to get the value, if you want to get a value from a function and use that value, then you need a return. So console logging is a side effect. Like, what console log does is it prints like whatever's inside the parentheses into the console, the output, so that I can see it. It's like a print function. It prints something out into this black box. That's a side effect. Console log itself is is a function. So we're calling a function inside of a function, and it's just a side effect. We don't need to pull anything out of that function for use downstream. But if we did want to, then we would do return a plus b. And now sum would be 3. We would be able to call this function and get something out of it. And then with this sum, we can, pass that into a different function called like get product. If we wanted to, add and multiply a value cumulatively, then we can do those things. And so that's the difference between returning and console log. Console log is kind of like, it's exactly like, let's say you just tell your friend to put on a shirt or something, right? It's a side effect. Like, you're not asking him for anything. You're just ordering him to do something, and it doesn't really affect you directly in any way. You can't get anything from that. You're telling him to do a side effect. You're saying, hey guy, like, put on a shirt, and then he might put on a shirt. That's like what happens when you console log. But when you return, you're essentially saying let's say you're telling a barista, hey, give me a cup of coffee, like give it to me so that I can like take it, and I can do whatever I want with the coffee. I can, I can do whatever I want with sum. When I get that return value from the coffee barista, I'm gonna get that coffee and I could spill it on the street, I could drink it, I could give it to someone else, I could do whatever I want with it, but I have it, and it's a direct output of the function versus like when I do this, when I just console log, I'm just telling someone to do something, and it doesn't really affect me. Is I think a good way to think about like the returning versus console logging versus yeah. What else is there? Objects. All right, objects are really important. I kind of went over them a little bit with the whole like Amazon T-shirt example that I belabored, but it's a way to represent something in real life. Essentially, is what we really use it for a lot. Like we create an object, and it represents a football player, and it tells me it's his height, how much he can bench press, how many years he's been playing, how big his hands are, like all these things I might be interested in for that football player. Like I have that all encapsulated in this object, in this bag. Whereas if I just tried to encapsulate all of that in a string, I couldn't really access. There's no rhyme or method. There's no method to the madness. If I try to get all that data into a string, it wouldn't be very clear. It would be very messy. And so you have your key and you have your value. You have your key and you have your value. It's just ways to represent real life objects. They're just collections of key value pairs, and because they have a key and a value, it's easy to say, his height is 6 feet, his weight is 225. Like, it's a good way to just encapsulate real world objects. It doesn't have to be like a actual object. It can be like a abstract concept, like a message or something could have a how long the text is, and like it could be anything. But that's how we usually use objects. And let's go a little bit more in depth into objects. So let's say we had a object called like your poker hand. No, poker card, right? And then can anyone think of any like properties that I might add onto this poker card? I guess we could just add a suit, heart, and then a value or something, which is I'll say it's an 8, and then that's all. I think that's kind of all that can really encapsulate in a poker card. And so how I can get the suit is I can do dot suit, and that'll give me a poker card dot suit. This thing is always so slow sometimes. It'll tell me it's heart. Or if I want to get the value of the poker card, I can get, value is 8, right? And what else? I can also get the properties on this by using square brackets. But if I use square brackets, I need to put an actual string value in here. So I need to do value or suit. And the reason why there's a different way to access them, there's 2 different ways, using dot or using square bracket. The square bracket allows you to put like a variable. So like var suit equals suit. And then you could put a variable in here like suit. As long as the value of this variable is a string, you can use variables to access properties, and that's gives you more flexibility, you know, because you can't, it like variables are always helpful because by its very name, it's variable. It can change. You can like reset it. You can set it to something else. Um, it's very dynamic. It's not just like set. And so you can change it. You know, you can use those like suit or you know, suit or value. Like you can use those conditional logics to set to assign to this variable. And so, or not conditional logic, but Boolean logic. Right? So this will become hard. Like you can kind of mix and match. You can morph the variable. So that's why the square bracket is useful, because you can use variables. If you don't use variables, then it's also useful because you can do stuff like, you know, if this was like suit, let's say we call it suit key, and then we call this value key, then we could access it by saying like suit key, you know. It's a lot more flexible in terms of like even what type of string you can use to denote the key. You can't do like dot suit key, because like this is not even it's not a proper like you can't use this character in like I don't think you can even declare a variable like that. It's like illegal in JavaScript's language. In the language, it's not legal to do this. Unexpected token. So you can't create variables with like it can only be alphanumeric. So to overcome that limitation, but strings can be whatever you want them to be. As soon as you put the apostrophe or quotes or double quotes, you can do whatever you want. There's no restriction there. So if you want to use like dashes and such, then the only way you can access that property is by doing like suit key. And how this all ties in is like, let's say we had a function, you know, display poker card, right? And it takes in a poker card. And now you can just return some HTML, like a div, and then inside that div, you say, you know, poker card dot. Let me just get rid of this. Poker card dot value div, and then another div. Poker card dot suit, right? And then now you're like, and then you kind of had to wrap the whole thing in a div because otherwise there's no like parent. But it's a very and you probably want to do like some indentations, like this is the parent, these are the kids, but and then now you could say, you know, display poker card, and then pass in your poker card, and then it should like display this, and I'm kind of combining HTML and JavaScript here. Technically, initially, right off the bat, if you would need like the help of libraries to kind of be able to do this kind of syntax, because normally you wouldn't be able to. So normally you might do something like, let's see here. Yeah, you might have to do something like document dot create element, and then, you know, this is valid JavaScript, and then you create like a div, and then you say, you know, var div equals document dot create element div, and then div dot inner text equals poker card dot value, and now you're creating a div, you're doing this, but like essentially, and then you know return. And then if you guys have seen some of the MDN docs. So document dot uh, create element. If you like, this is how you work with. This is how JavaScript and HTML kind of come together. Is like you can create an element, and this is all JavaScript, and now this element represents an actual HTML element, and this is how JavaScript and HTML work together. But nowadays there's a lot of libraries, so you don't have to go through all this. It's essentially kind of boilerplatey stuff, and so now you can, with things like React, you can just return a literal and make it a lot simpler on yourself than calling create element and then setting the element's text using other functions. But that is like what React is doing under the hood. Is it's still using all of this stuff, but it's just like packaged up into a set of functions that we can use. So someone already did all that heavy lifting of like creating all those elements by using these APIs, these web APIs, and now they package it up into a nice library that we can just use so that life becomes easier for us. But initially, right off the bat, you guys may have to start off using things like document.createElement, and so that's kind of how objects and actually displaying things come together, because essentially we're displaying objects at the end of the day. Like going to the standings, all of these are just objects. Like the San Francisco 49ers is an object that has like wins, losses, ties, win percentage, all these properties on that object, and we're essentially just taking that object and then accessing the properties on that object and then displaying those properties by creating HTML elements that have those property values as their text. So yeah, objects are important. They hold all the data together. They encapsulate data into meaningful chunks. Like in the football case, for example, New Orleans Saints could be an object. Atlanta Falcons could be an object. And they're all objects that have these set of properties that tell you more about them. But they're organized into these bundles of objects versus like if you just had everything floating, if you just had like var Falcons number of wins equals 3, and then you had like var Saints number of wins equals 5. Like it would be a lot messier, and like there would be so many of these variables, and we were not really grouping them together in any meaningful way, so it'd be really messy. But if we had var Falcons data equals number of wins is 5, number of losses is 2, and it's like very organized and it's structured, and then you could just repeat that for every single team the same exact way, and then now you have the standings page for the NFL, because now you're just gonna have maybe an array of these, right? All teams might be an array of these objects. Sorry, it's not. Name is Falcons or something. You just have an array, and then you just loop through the array, and then for each object, you just render the HTML with these properties as the text value of the HTML. And where does this data come from? It probably comes from a server which is just the NFL's computer data center, and that they just probably have a bunch of databases with this information in the tables, and then, you know, as the web application, I ask the server, can you give me this data? And the data will come in this form. Like, it can just be an array of objects, and I'm gonna like access that object in that array, access those properties, and we saw how to access properties like poker card dot suit. Same thing would be like team dot number of wins, and then now you have this value 5, which we care about, because now we'll do something like, you know, document dot create element div, and then element dot inner text equals team dot number of wins, and now you have this div right here, and then you just do that like a bunch of times. And the nice thing about programming is you can, you know, once you know how to do something for one object, you can just do like a for loop and then do the same thing repetitively on each item, and so it doesn't take that much time. Those are objects. Yeah, so objects are useful because they can represent things. So consider Pusheen, and yeah, the cat. If you try to, you could use an array to hold all the data that represents a Pusheen, which is like the age and the color or the name. But there's no really rhyme or reason. You have to like kind of infer based on the order, and there's a lot that can go wrong with that. So for this reason, it's better to encapsulate data as a object, because now there's a key that actually tells you, hey, this is like a description of what my value is. It's just a better way to communicate this. Arrays are still useful though, because they're useful as storing a list when, you know, each item just needs to be in a list. It doesn't matter. There's no real property name. It's just like a bag of items, and you don't really care. You know, each item is ideally, you know, consistent, and you just need to store them all because you need to work with more than one item. Let's see, creating an object. Whoa. So you use these squiggly brackets. They're kind of like starting a function, but instead you're creating an object. And then an object keys are always strings. So even if you don't denote it specifically as a string, like you're not using string name, string age, it'll become that. It'll just be transformed to be a string. You could specifically do that. Like here in my example, like I actually used a quotation marks and said it's a string, but if I didn't do that, it would still be a string. So usually you only denote it as a string if you're using like weird characters. Otherwise it's just, there's no point really to use a string just here. But the actual value, you need to actually set it as whatever data type it is. So, you know, it can be a number, it could be a string, it could be another object, it could be a function, it could be anything. The value could be anything you want. So that's creating an object. So accessing the object. Again, you can use a square bracket But if you use a square bracket, you need to pass in a value that is either a string, directly a string by using the quotations, or passing in a variable that has the value of a string. You could do either or. And this just adds to the flexibility of what you could do. And I kind of went over this a little bit, but if you try to access something that's not in the object, it will return undefined. So we kind of went over this whole like truthy falsy thing, but let's go back to the poker example. If I have a poker card, and let's say like if my poker card dot let's just say I didn't know the value, I only knew the suit, and then if I said poker card dot value, if essentially I'm saying if I know the value, because this is going to be truthy, it's only going to go in here if this exists. Then if so if this essentially this is saying, yeah, like there is a value on that poker card, like I know what the value is. So here within it I could say if poker card dot value equals ace, go all in. But it won't go into this because there's no value. So else I don't know what to do. Because this becomes falsy because it's undefined, because the value doesn't exist yet. Now if I put a value of ace, then I'll go all in because I know what my value is, and then my value is an ace, so I'll go all in. So that's kind of what it means by when you're accessing a property that doesn't exist on an object, it'll become undefined. And if you put undefined within an if, it becomes casted to be falsy because undefined, null, zero, empty string, not a number are all falsy, and also the value false. And then everything else is truthy. And so yeah, the final slide right here. It's been a wild ride, but right here we're creating methods on objects. And so basically I told you before that objects can have any value. The key needs to be a string, but the actual value can be anything. It could be a string, it could be another function, it could be another object, it could be an array, it could be number, whatever you want, Boolean. But in this case it's a function, and that's kind of confusing. But that's exactly what console log is. So we've been using a lot of console logs. So console log is an object. So like let's say var log, var console is an object, and then log is a function that, this is gonna be really weird. I am a wrapper around console log. And so now I could just do console dot log, right? Maybe console might be hold on, reference key is not defined. I might be stepping on some toes here just because, let me see, because I think console might be like a global. So I don't think I can do this because I don't think I can, like, because console is already an object and I'm like creating an object that overrides the global. So let's just say, let's just forget about that example. It's a bad example. Like math, uh, let's say arithmetic, arithmetic. I'm not sure if that's how you spell it right now, but arithmetic. And then you had add, and that's a function that takes a, b, and then it returns a plus b. So I can say, var sum equals arithmetic dot add 1, 2, and this should be 3. So the difference is, like, I could, normally when you call functions, you give them a name like this. I could do that and it would still work. Oh, crap. But it's kind of redundant because I already gave it a name by putting a property, so I don't need to give it a name because it already has something I call it by. And then, subtract is a function that takes a, b, and returns a minus b. And the reason why we might want to do this is, like, again, to encapsulate everything into an object. So it's like organized, kind of like filing cabinets. You put all your arithmetic functions into this object. Put all your what kind of other, like, geometry functions into another object. Put all your algebraic functions and then your other math functions into its own object. And then you just do dot, because dot is essentially how you access the property. Or you could do, the other way, add. It's just a little longer, a little more words, but they both should do the same thing. And we've been using it all along because console is an object and it has a log property, which is a function. Just like this, it's a method. When there's a function that's a property of an object, we call it a method. So, we've been using it all along. Console.log. Essentially, I was kind of creating it, like, someone made this object called console and they put a log function, and that does what we, outputs to the log. But I can't do that because I think I'm overriding it, and that's not allowed. So, yeah. And, all of these are the same thing. Document, dot create element. Document is an object, and then we do dot to access the property on that object, and then we do create element, which is a method on that object, which kind of looks like, document, and then there's a create element, and it takes in a tag, and it probably does something like, oh, if tag equals div, create div, and that's somewhere else, or return, because, like, we get it back, so it has to return something because we're assigning this variable to the function call, so the function call has to return something. So, like, return create div, and then if tag equals span, return create span. It's probably like how it works under the hood, some variation of this. But it's a document object. It has create element as a property, and the value of that property just happens to be a function. And yeah, that's pretty much it. There is this countdown, or there's still more of today's workshop to be done, so I would focus on that if you haven't gotten around to that. But tomorrow I'll be available for help if you guys need help on creating this countdown page with JavaScript. And so you know, you might for an example, I think you can do like if you just do document dot var let's see. Let's just remove this for now. Just to give a brief little example, if you do something like document dot create element div, and then you do div dot inner text equals test. I think it should. Well, I guess you need some type of hook here. So let's say you had a div here, and you gave it an ID of test, and you do something like document dot get element by ID test var test div, and then you did test div dot inner text equals test. This should, yeah, there it is. It like you generated that. That's how like JS and HTML work together, is you can grab this element. So get element by ID is it queries the element by the ID tag, and it grabs it for you and stores it in this variable in JavaScript. And then you say test div dot inner text is test. You set some property on the div, and it'll listen to you. You know, you can change it if you want, and it'll become test2. The reason why the create thing didn't work was because there was no root. So essentially, I could do something like, now you need at least one element to refer to that JavaScript needs to like hang on to as sort of reference. You can't just start creating things because it won't know where to create them. So it won't know where to place these elements. But I could do something like var child div equals document dot create element div. So that makes a div, but I've made a div, but it's not attached to the HTML yet. I need to somehow attach it to the HTML. Because right now this element is just floating in limbo. It's just in JavaScript land. It's not in the HTML document yet. So what I could do is I could say, child div dot. First, I want to, at least create a text so I'll know if it actually showed up on the page or not. So this one's the child. And then what I could do is I could say test div dot append child div. And now I've made an element, and then I've like attached it as a kid to the parent, and so it shows up on the doc. The reason why before, when I created the element, it didn't work is because I never attached it to anything. You need to like attach it as a child, or attach it as with some reference to an existing HTML element, or else it won't know where to place these elements, if that makes sense. So this is kind of like how you'll do the exercise, I believe. This exercise, putting it all together. And it all does tie together because, this is now we learned this is an object, and this is a property of that object. And, this is a function. We're invoking the function. These are strings as data types. What we could do is we could, set this whole thing put this whole thing in a function, create child, right? And then I could wrap all this stuff in this function, spacing's weird, but and then I could just call it instead of having to like do all that. I can just call it and then it'll work the same way. But now I've encapsulated everything into a function, so you can create your functions and then call them. So you can organize these things. And yeah, that's pretty much all I got for you guys. It is kind of arduous without the libraries that I've mentioned, like React, like doing all of this stuff. I'm not sharing my screen anymore. But yeah, initially I think it helps to start off with that, just to know how it all works under the hood, and then we can take some shortcuts. But yeah, that is what I got for you guys. Feel free to work on the workshops. Ask me for any help that you guys may need. And yeah.